In this video, we'll be discussing using MAGNIFi in Avid Media Composer. So how does MAGNIFi work? Well, the first thing is you'll need a clip in your bin. I have this clip here of an airplane taking off. And I want to mark ins and outs where I want to use the footage. So I'll mark an in point here and take it to about there and mark an out point. And then I want to create a sequence. So to do that, I'm going to turn off the audio. I don't need any audio in this clip. So turn off the audio and then just drag this down to my timeline to create a new sequence. And now there's a new sequence in my bin. You can see that here. I can highlight it and rename it. We'll just call it MAGNIFi. And there we go. So how do you apply MAGNIFi? You'll need to go to the Tools menu, go to Effect Palette, go to the dTective category, choose MAGNIFi, and there's a couple ways to do this. One is to drag and drop down to your clip, just like that. But I'll undo that because you can also go into segment mode, click on that, highlight your clip in your timeline, and then double click the effect in the effect palette, and that will apply it. So I don't need to be in segment mode, so I'm going to turn that off. And then I'll press home on my keyboard to take this timeline back to the beginning. And then go to Tools and Effect Editor. And I'll close that because you can also click this button here to get to the Effect Editor, the Effect Mode button. And that opens the Effect Editor. So either way you want to do it is fine. And now we have the Effect Editor. And what you'll see when you open this Effect Editor is two boxes. You have a box here and a box here. The green one is your target, and the white one, the white bordered one, that is your output. So you'll drag your target down to whatever you're trying to highlight, just like that. And you'll see that the output box fills in with the target. Now this box has handles on the corners, the sides, the top, the bottom, and you can click those little handles and resize the box. If you grab the handle on the corner, that will maintain the aspect ratio. So just drag that, just like that. There you go. If you grab the top, that'll be the height, just like that. And if you grab the sides, that's the width. So just like that. And of course, we can reposition the output box. Just click on it and drag it wherever you'd like. And the same thing here, you can resize it. You have handles in the corner, sides, top, bottom, same exact controls. So however large you want it, and we'll get into the output modes in a bit. But there's our output box. So now that's set up, we'll talk about the controls over here in the effect editor. The first control you have is the target box position, X and Y coordinates. You can click on X, drag to the left, drag to the right. Let me undo that. And that's the same as clicking and dragging here to the left and right. There's also Y coordinates. That's the same as dragging up and down. Drag up and drag down. You see these controls change, these numbers change. Or you can drag here as well. Click and drag like so. All right. There's also a border option. Right now the border size is defaulting to 3 and it's green. You can change the size of the border if you like. And there's a color option. Let me twirl this down, open this up. And here are your color options. So if you want to choose from the color picker, you can double click this swatch right here. That opens your color picker. And you can choose any color you'd like. So if you want a red, you can do that. There's colors here to pick from. Pretty standard color picker. Once you selected your color, just push OK. If you want to choose a color from within the Composer window, from within this window here, click on the color swatch, hold down the left mouse button, drag it, pick your color, and then double click to apply. So I'll do that again. So left mouse click, drag the eyedropper tool, highlight a color, double click to apply. And then there's sliders here. So if you wanted a pure red border, drag the red slider to the right And drag green and blue to the left all the way. Another border is red. And this is the opacity of the border. So drag this to the left and your opacity drops to anything from nothing to full and everything in between. Just like that. Okay, and then the next one is the output. Same thing here, you have position, which is X and Y coordinates. That's the exact same thing as dragging. You can drag here as well. And then you have your width and height. So click and drag. Click and drag. That's the same as grabbing the handles on the output box itself. So however you prefer to do that. Okay, and then for your border, there's a couple of options here. There's the default type, which is line. Here's your size. Click and drag. And again, there's a color. So same thing here, you can use the eyedropper tool to pick a color from within the video. Just left click, hold the left mouse button down, highlight your color, double click to apply. Or use the sliders here if you want red, or if you want, say we want blue. And all these colors are able to be chosen from these sliders as well. Okay. There's also an option for no border at all, so like that, or you can choose feather, and feather just feathers the edges. So if this output box was much larger, you can really see how it's getting feathered on the edges. See how they just sort of fade away on the edges there. So we'll stick with line, and we'll resize this back down. Yeah, something like that. Okay, then you have processing. So that's going to be options like zoom, rotation, brightness, all these type of image adjustments. So zoom, you can zoom in on the footage inside the box like so, which is essentially the same thing as clicking and dragging here. So however you prefer to do that, but if you wanted to zoom from within here, you can do that. You can rotate it. If you want to type in an adjustment, so maybe you want this to be 90 degrees, if your slider is highlighted, use your number pad, type in 90, push enter, and there's 90 degrees. And that's true with any of these sliders. You can highlight them, type in a number, 50, hit enter, and that's applied. So I'll put this back to 0. Put this back to 0. Then you have contrast, gamma, sharpen, and then opacity. Of course, opacity would be the opacity of the output itself. So if you wanted it to be 100% opaque, that's the default. And then 0 is completely invisible and everything in between. And then going down here, you have a shape border option. So right now it's defaulting to square. If you wanted this border to be rounded off, you can choose the roundness option. So anything from 100 on the roundness to somewhere in between with rounded corners or fully square. The default color mode is RGB. Before I do that, let's talk about the output mode. Right now it's defaulting to the output box being sort of in a quadrant or whatever size you choose. But you can also have it be full or 90% full. So if we choose 90% full, then we can look at some of the options in the sampling. So right now we're choosing point as one of the mathematical filters. You can also choose triangle, quadratic, cubic, CatRom, Gaussian, or sync. And I'll choose, I think triangle's fine. And then you also have force aspect. Right now it's set to original, but you can do 4:3, You could do 16 by 9. You could do fit to whatever size your output box is set to. And I'll just stick with original. You also have color mode options here. The default is RGB, but you can choose average, luminance, red, green, or blue. These are all channels that you can pick from. But I'll switch it back to the default of RGB. Let's change this back to the default output mode. And there's another option here for over background. That would assume that you have 2 tracks of video, and I can show you what that looks like. Here's a sequence with over background selected. You can see here that video track 2 is the airplane, video track 1 is me talking to this guy at a truck show. And here's what over background looks like. So there's 2 tracks of video. The background is video track 1 and video track 2 is the airplane. If I was to go back in the effect editor and turn off over background, you'd see you're back to the airplane footage. So let's go back to our original sequence and we'll discuss keyframing. Let me open up the effect editor again. And keyframing is one of the major things you'll be doing in MAGNIFi, since you're going to want to track objects, track subjects. Like in this case, this airplane takes off, so we're going to track as it takes off. And the way you do that is by adding keyframes. And there's a few things to know about keyframes in MAGNIFi. The first thing to know is there's a button down here that says auto key all parameters. And what that does is, with this checked, and if I move this down a little bit on the timeline, and I want to add a keyframe right here, if I drag this target box to follow the airplane and I resize it, you'll see that Avid has added keyframes automatically. And it added keyframes not only on the position and the width and height of the target box, it added keyframes all the way down for everything. So all the parameters you have in here that are keyframeable, Avid added keyframes because I had auto key all parameters checked. If I have this deselected and I add another keyframe down here, for example, let's go up here and watch what happens. I'm going to drag this target box and I'll resize a little bit, and you'll see that it did add keyframes for the position, the width and height, but nothing else, because I had auto key all parameters deselected. Okay. Now this auto key all parameters, I'll make another keyframe and I'll check this box. And I'll make another one. This only applies to adjustments you're making inside the composer window. So keyframes are automatically added to anything I do in here that involves me making adjustments inside this composer window. It's added these keyframes automatically. But if I make any adjustments inside the effect editor itself, even with auto key all parameters checked, it's not going to create any keyframes unless I create them manually. And I'll show you what I mean. So for example, if I go down here, let's go back a little bit. And let's say I wanted to have, I want to change the brightness of this output box. You would think, you'd go, well, okay, I'm going to add, I'll change the brightness right here. Here's a slider. I'll just change the brightness. And it will add a keyframe, but it didn't. You can see there's no keyframes added in the brightness track here. So how would you do that? There's a few ways to do it. One way is to go down here and choose Add Keyframe. And you'll see when I click this, there's a few choices to make. One is Add to Active Parameter. And what that means is the active parameter is the slider that's highlighted. You can tell it's highlighted when there's a little, when it's filled in, the circle's filled in. So if I clicked on this, that's the active parameter. So brightness as the active parameter, it's filled in. If I choose Add Active Parameter, it will add a keyframe only to brightness. So if I do that, you can see it added a keyframe only to the brightness track right here. I'll undo that, Control Z. If I choose Add to Active Group, the active group in this case is going to be the processing group. So it will add keyframes to all these parameters inside of this processing group. So Add to Active Group, it added keyframes all the way down only in this group. So let's undo that, Control Z. Add to Open Groups means any group that's open. So these groups are all open because they're twirled down. So if I turned this off, if I twirled this back up, now that's closed. Okay. And I'll close this. So when I say add to open groups, it's only going to add keyframes to the groups that have been opened. So nothing in shape border, no keyframes are added there because it was closed, but it did add keyframes to everything else that was opened. Okay, and then add to all parameters. That's essentially the same thing as what the auto key all parameters is doing. It's the same thing. So it adds keyframes to all the possible parameters. Okay, let's undo that. And you can also choose add to enabled groups and MAGNIFi. By default, everything's enabled anyway. So that's essentially the same thing as add to all parameters. So add to enabled groups, and that adds keyframes to everything, as you can see. So let's actually make a change here. We'll make a change to the brightness, make it darker. And you'll see what happens when the keyframes work. You can see that it goes from lighter to darker and back to light. These are the keyframes here. You can see that it was lighter there, darker here, and back to lighter here. Another way to add a keyframe, let's say you want to add a keyframe on contrast, for example. If you right-click on the track itself and choose Add Keyframe, that's another way to do it. So click on that, make sure the track is highlighted like contrast here, Add Keyframe, and a keyframe is added to the contrast track, and then make your adjustment. And you'll see that worked. So that's probably the easiest way to make sure you're adding a keyframe to the parameter that you're only wanting to adjust. For example, brightness, rotate, etc. If you want to move a keyframe, you can do that. Just hold the Alt key down. You'll notice your cursor becomes a little finger when you highlight your keyframe. Click it with the left mouse button and drag. That lets you move the keyframes. If you want to move all the keyframes, there's a couple ways to do that. If you choose Control A on your keyboard, that will highlight all the keyframes. Hold Alt, choose any one of them, and that'll move them all. Just like that. You can also select keyframes from within the effect editor. Just click on one, like so. And the same thing here, you can hold Alt and then drag it if you want. And then Control A works a little bit differently in the effect editor. In this case, if I hit Control A, it will select all the keyframes, but only for that particular parameter. So in this case, I chose all the keyframes for rotate. If I wanted to choose all the keyframes in contrast, highlight one of them, hit Control A, and they're all selected. And then if I want to delete any of them, highlight them, hit delete on the keyboard, and it's gone. I'll undo that. Same thing here, highlight one, hit delete, and it's gone. I'll undo that. If you want to save your effect for future use, you can do that. Just go up to the little plug icon here on the top of the effect editor. Click on it. You notice your cursor becomes a little finger, little hand. That lets you drag the effect into your bin, just like so. Then you can highlight it, click on it, type in a name, hit enter. That saves the effect. And then if I want to remove the effect from the timeline, I can do that. Go down here. This is the remove effect button. Click on that. That removes the effect. And if I want to reapply it just to make sure my settings were all saved, just drag and drop like so. And there's my saved MAGNIFi effect, just like that. And that's how MAGNIFi works in Avid Media Composer.